we're back. We are going to talk about the quilt stitch. We've got several different ways that you can pull all of your pieces together and actually make it into a sandwiched quilt. The definition of a quilt is that it has that sandwich. Definition of a blanket is that it's one big piece. So, quilting. We didn't really talk about it yet. I'm just going to real fast show you. When you are quilting, you've got this batting, and you want to make sure that your background fabric is larger all the way around than your batting, which is just a little bit larger than your quilt top. Your quilt top is all the hard work we've been doing for a year. You have to get it to this point before you can actually start stitching, and there's several ways that you can handle it from that point on. We're going to talk a little bit about 3 or 4 of them. So, number 1. I'm going to show you a little bit about how to do a hand quilt project. The hand quilting is probably takes more time than the piecing, because you are going to be stitching by hand stitches to bring all of these pieces together. Several things that you need to know. When you are hand stitching, you don't want a big needle. So these are regular sharps. You can see they're almost 2 inches long. That is way too long to do quilting, because you've got to be able to get your finger on the top of this needle and your thumb on the bottom of the needle comfortably. So we want something that's about this long. For example, this one, just a little bit shorter. This one would be a little easier to use for quilting. The eye on this is very oval, and the quilting eye should be very small and round. So this rounder eye is a quilting needle. You have to be able to get to both ends. I've seen them as small as 1 inch. Professional hand quilters will get 12 stitches in an inch. Don't expect it. I can never do it. I enjoy hand quilting, but if I can get 4 stitches in an inch, I'm feeling pretty good. I'm going to show you here. This one was hand quilted. For them to do the hand quilting, they did not try and do 12 stitches in a row, but they also used a contrasting thread, which I thought was really cute. It matches the sashing and border, but it highlights a little bit more here, and you can see that it's a hand-stitched quilt. It's cute. This one was also hand-stitched, and this one was stitched in the ditch, which means right along the seams. You can actually see the stitches a little better on this side. And again, they didn't try and do 12 in an inch. If you can see it, you can see that they probably have 5 in an inch. And that's okay. That's a very, very comfortable quilt stitch. So, different ways. When you use a contrasting stitch, try and make it as even as you can. You don't necessarily need to have a lot of stitches in that inch in order to make it look really good. But if they're regularly spaced all the way along, you're going to have a much cleaner line, and it'll look sharp and very pretty. So if you're not hiding your thread, be very consistent with your stitch. This specifically says hand quilting, and it's a really important thing for you to know that when you get thread for hand quilting, you want to make sure you never put it in your sewing machine. This is for hand quilting. It's a little bit thicker than regular cotton thread, and it has a little bit of a covering on the thread, and that covering may include a little bit of beeswax, and it will start to gum up your sewing machine. So it's not good for using on your sewing machine when you're quilting. This is specifically for hand quilting. So we're going to cut a piece of it off, and I usually stick between 12 and 18 inches, maybe from here to the inside of my elbow. I use that small needle that small-eyed needle. And as I get older, I keep thinking, why do I do this? But it's a slightly larger thread, and it's stiffer, and it makes it easy for you to get it into the needle. We don't tie a knot. You could, if you're comfortable pulling it through your fabric and you know it's going to set. But the easiest thing to do, stick it in, just into the batting, wrap it around a few times and come back up. And when you get to that point, stop. I cannot quilt without a thimble. This needle is going to start hurting me really fast. When I was growing up, my mom had a friend who was a very, very good quilter who used to be in the CIA. And she had had her fingerprints redone several times because she kept quilting without a thimble and it would change her fingerprints. And so she kept having to go back at work and get her fingerprint done again and again. I thought that was a funny story. You're going to go in really close, depending on how comfortable you are. This is about a little over 1/8 of an inch. And we're going to go down and right back up and down and right back up and down and right back up. And then you pull it through. One of the other things about hand quilting, and you can see that it's just hiding. This is a good color for this fabric. Another thing about it is that you need your fabric and your batting to be loose. So while I'm doing it this way right now, if you've got quilt frames or a quilting hoop, you want your fabric to be very loose so that when you start to pull this through, it does not break your needle. And the last time I demonstrated this stitch, that's exactly what I did, was break my needle off. This is a lap quilting frame. It will open up enough to get your quilt in there. You can see how long that screw is, so you've got plenty of room for your batting, your thread, or your top and your back to fit inside that frame. Keep it loose like this, not this loose, but loose so that when you start to bend it, the fabric just kind of flows with you. You do not want it to be tight like embroidery. So this is an excellent one to do small projects. If you're using this for a large project, which can be done, you're going to have that blanket sitting on your lap the whole time, and you are going to feel very warm. So it's best to only do that in the winter, in my cold house. One of the aids is beeswax. If you run your thread through the beeswax first, then it'll slide through the fabric a little bit easier. And another great hint is you can get these little round discs of plastic, almost rubber, and they will help grasp the edge of that needle and pull it right through. That saves your fingers a lot as well. So that's how you do hand quilting. If you have any question, go to the Pinterest page or look up some of the wonderful YouTube videos on how to hand quilt. There's a lot of them out there. We're going to move on now, and we're going to talk a little bit about machine quilting your quilt. I'm going to show you how you can use your domestic sewing machine in order to do the quilting. There are conditions when you use a machine. One, you have to be able to fit it under your arm into the eye of your sewing machine. So if you've got a full-size quilt, it's going to be much more difficult to do this. Two ways that you can do it. One, you roll up the edges with the sandwich and you get to the end and fit your needle in there. But the other thing you can do is quilt as you go. So you quilt each of your blocks and then you sew on your sashes. And when you sew the back of the quilt together, you're going to have a larger piece on this block than you did on this block, and you just fold it over and you sew right along that edge. There are some wonderful tutorials. If you want to learn how to quilt as you go, make sure that you get onto Facebook, onto YouTube, onto Pinterest, and find some of those wonderful, wonderful quilt instructions that will show you how to do that one. I haven't ever really tried it. I've always been afraid of that fold on the back that I'm not going to be able to get it to go right. So if I've done one, it's almost always on a baby quilt that I feel I can roll up and do. There are some different rules when you're using your sewing machine than when you're doing it by hand. You still have to have your sandwich. You still want to make sure that all your layers are there. But you don't want to have the pins in the way. So one of the easy things to do is to put it in a hoop that will fit under the needle of your machine. I picked up this smaller hoop. It's not going to do very much at the same time. But if you've got an intricate place that you want to do it, this might be what you need. This one is going to be extremely difficult to get under the needle of your machine. Second thing that you want to know is that you want to drop your dog feeds if you're just doing free motion. You want to be in control of where your quilt is going and how fast it's going, rather than letting those dog feeds in your sewing machine pull the fabric at a regular pace. So drop those or cover those, whatever your sewing machine requires, so that those aren't pulling. Unless you're just doing straight lines. And if you're just doing straight lines and following the line of your quilt block, then this is a wonderful tool. This is a walking foot, and it pulls the top of your quilt at the same rate that the bottom of your quilt is moving. And that's really, really helpful. If they're separated, but the presser foot is down, the bottom will pull more evenly than the top, and you'll start getting puckers, either on the top or the bottom, depending on the weight of the fabric. If you've got this, it's pulling both pieces at the same time, you get that regular and even stitch that you're looking for. And it's a wonderful way to do the straight edges of a quilt block. One of the things I didn't mention in hand quilting, but I want to make sure that you're aware of, is that when you quilt something, you need to make sure that the stitches are close enough together to keep that batting in place. You don't want it moving all around. Now, you don't have to have the lines right next to each other, but you do need to have them close enough together that the fist of your hand, when placed on that top, will have stitching underneath it. So if I were to just do the hexagons on this, you can see that there is not a way that I can use just the edge of that as my guide. I need to have something in the middle. So I would either, I don't know, do it here and make a good 1/2 inch to 1 inch inside the lines rather than on the line, or I would stipple it. In fact, I think that's what I'll be doing with this. Stippling is when you just go crazy lines like this all over the place. And if I do this, it's going to look like the path of the bee, and I think that will work just right for this. It's a wonderful technique for filling in any kind of spaces that you have in your quilt. So if you've got bigger spaces, that might be a way to do it. The third way you can do it is you get a quilting pattern. It's usually plastic, and you put it on your fabric and you trace those lines with a pencil or a fabric pin or something that's going to easily wash out, but will show you exactly where you need to go. So when you've got it under your needle and you're holding the edges, you'll be able to move it so that your needle is going into the lines that you've drawn. Please practice. Get yourself a little thing like this and do a couple of lines and practice it. Because your dog feet are not pulling the fabric, you're completely in control. You don't want to go too fast or too slow. You want that to be as even as you can. And so practice before you start sewing it on the machine. Another thing that everybody needs to be aware of is this hand stitching thread does not go into your sewing machine. There's a coating on it that starts to gum it up, and it's a heavier thread that makes your machine work harder when it's already working hard to get through all of your layers. This is specifically for machine quilting, and you can see it here, machine quilting. So this is going to be enough to do the whole quilt easily, but you've got to also have it in your bobbin So make sure that when you buy your thread, you get enough for your whole project. I think that my quilt project will be okay with this spool of thread. You make sure that it's even. You make sure that you're moving the fabric through all the layers. Don't just put your hands down and expect it to go right when you're pushing down on it, because you're mostly just pushing the top layer. A lot of people have had success by wearing rubber gloves while they do that. Or there's quilter's gloves, which is a rubber glove that you paid more money for. So put your hands on it, grasp it, and hold it together so that while you're doing it, no matter what your lines are, you've got control of all the layers of your quilt. And you may not need to have quilting frames if you've got your pins separated long enough so that it's holding it together without being in your way. You want to be able to do a good 8 to 12 inches without having to remove a pin. So keep aware of that. There is a product, it's a fabric glue, it's a basting glue is what they call it. And you put your backing down and you put your batting down and you put this down and then you flip it back and spray and put it back on, and it will hold your pieces together so that they're less likely to separate as you're moving it around under your sewing machine needle. Hopefully something like that will also help you. I'd be careful not to use too much. Again, you don't want it to gum up your machine. If your needle is going through that, it may start to get gummy, so be really aware of something like that. I think that you're going to have a lot of success either way that you do this, but there are more ways, and Leslie's going to teach you. And so I will turn the time over to her.
Right now we're going to talk about long arm quilting for finishing your bicentennial quilt. I'm not a long arm quilter, but I've had a lot of quilts that were done that way. And for those of us who do quilt that way, it's also called checkbook quilting, because you write a check to the quilter and that's how you get your quilting done. So some might say that that's cheating, but it works for me, so I don't enjoy that part of the process. So I'll talk a little bit about long arm quilting from my experience today. So first of all, let me tell you some terms that they might use. A long arm quilter might say, do you want an edge to edge pattern? Which means they do the same pattern, edge to edge, kind of regardless of what your quilt is. Like, they don't care if you did red, white, and blue. They don't care if you did circles. They don't care what you did. Do you want edge to edge? And they just do the same pattern over the entire quilt. This is an example of edge to edge. Happens to be kind of a crazy example because it's kind of like triangles. But this was edge to edge quilting done over the entire quilt. She didn't really care what my blocks looked like. And I wanted it that way. So that was my choice. But that is a term they may ask you, edge to edge. Or sometimes the term is E to E, edge to edge. This is also edge to edge quilting. Same pattern done over the entire quilt. And it didn't really matter what was underneath it. It was just a pattern that I picked that I liked, that kind of was florally, that went with my fabric. And it's kind of paisley, like my fabric actually. So that also is edge to edge quilting. Okay. The other kind of long arm quilting that you will run across is not edge to edge, and it's called custom quilting. And custom quilting is more where the quilter still uses her big long arm machine, but does things that reflect what your quilt was made out of. For example, on this star here. That's custom quilting because she actually took the shape of my star and did a custom thing inside the star. And if you notice on the rest of the flag, she did wavy lines to indicate the stripes in the flag. And then inside these little bands of color, there's waves in here, and then different waves in the blue. And then she put stars in the blue. Actually, I can see them now. She did stars in the blue, stars, and then waves, and then the curlies in the applique star. So this is called custom long arm machine quilting. But you also could do custom quilting on your home machine as well. It doesn't have to be just a long arm, but that's a term they will use. They will say, would you like edge to edge or custom? And sometimes the quilter, most long arm quilters, I'll maybe make this generalization. I think most long arm quilting tends to be edge to edge, but not always. It doesn't have to be. So custom quilting is the other term. You will pay a little bit more usually for custom quilting because it takes the quilter a longer time to decide what to do in each section, and there's just more it's more labor intensive for them. So generally speaking, I would say that custom long arm quilting is a little bit more expensive than just an edge to edge, which is just the same pattern, repetitive, and in many cases, I'd say probably almost, with the exception of maybe this quilt and maybe one other, I've always been very content with the edge to edge long arm method. It's nice to find a long arm quilter that you like, and I have 2 or 3 that I have used and really like. And so the one that I started with, I finally met her, and I had probably 10 or 15 quilt tops in my stash that I had never finished because I don't like to quilt, and I'm not really great about hand quilting, and nor did I have a machine that did very well with using my own machine to quilt. So I found the name of this long arm quilter, and so we met once a month, and I would give her a new top and she'd give me the old one, and I would write that check. And we did that for probably about 1.5 years, maybe 2 years, and I kept until I finally got caught up in all my quilting, and it worked for me. And she was a custom machine quilter, and she did a beautiful job. She did this one. She did this flag one. I was always very tickled with how she did that. To find a long arm quilter, I would, if you have any quilting friends, I would definitely see who they like to give business to. You could also contact some of the quilt guilds in the area, and oftentimes they'll keep a list of their members that do it for hire. Sometimes if you go to a quilt shop, they'll have a list of people that are either affiliated with them or advertise with them or whatever. They sometimes will have a list of suggested long arm machine quilters. If you go to, and they may do it themselves in the shop. A lot of shops you see now have long arm machines or mid arm machines. The long arms are very long and do the really king size quilts. The mid arms machines are a little bit smaller. They also could do larger quilts, but they're a little bit smaller machine. But a lot of quilt shops now rent those. They will train you on how to use them, and they will rent them to you. You pay for the time on the machine, and you can quilt your own quilt as using a long arm machine. So that's kind of cool. That's a good option. I can think of at least 2 shops in the area that do that. So kind of poke around and see where you could learn how to do it and do your own. And I can think of a couple shops that do them in their shop too. So just finding that right person and develop a relationship with them. Some of the things that you should ask them is, how big do they want? Like if I was to hand her my top, how much past the size of my top does she want, or he or she, I'll say she, but it's either. How far beyond the edge of my top do I want the batting and the backing to extend? Because just like with any other kind of quilting, it kind of gets taken in as the quilting is done. So sometimes they may say, 3 inches is good. That's not usually the answer. It's usually 5-ish. And sometimes if you're cutting it a little close, you'll have to ask them, I only can squeeze 3 inches around out of my batting and my backing. Is that going to be okay? It may be yes or no. So, because they have a comfortable level that they're at. So that's a good question to ask them. How much do you need to leave around before the quilting even starts? And I would say 5 inches probably is average, but that's about what I usually leave, 4 to 5. So the next question, do I have to press the quilt top and the backing before I give it to you? And of course the answer is yes, you do. And then the other question is, do I need to trim all my loose threads? And I have been known not to do that, though I get mocked a little bit about for not doing that very well. So yes, the answer is yes. They do like you have all your threads trimmed, probably on both sides. So look at your back side of your quilt, do a little trimming, and especially on the front, because they can kind of get mixed up in the quilting. You don't want that to determine how it turns out. So yes, you need to get it ready for them. Do you provide the batting, or do I need to provide it? That's also, some of them have batting. Sometimes they'll sell it to you and they have it on the big rolls, and they'll tell you what kind they have, and then you can either make that decision to use their batting at whatever they're charging or provide your own. That's also a question that you need to know. And if you're unsure on the batting, sometimes asking them, is good. So Lots of times a blend is good, a cotton is good. My kids tend to like quilts that have the poly batting because they're softer, squishier. I don't know. They just have a preference. So if I'm making it for my kids, I will lean toward a polyester batting that has a little bit more cushion to it. And these quilts here have more of the cotton blend batting. They're a little thinner. Still warm, but it's just a different feel. The next thing you could ask them, are we doing edge to edge? Are we doing custom? And if they are an edge to edge person, they have often a lot of patterns to show you. For example, on this quilt with all the crazy zany stuff, I saw that immediately and knew that I wanted it for that quilt. So sometimes a long arm quilter will have a book of patterns that you can kind of look through. What's nice about some of the long arm quilters that have the computer component to them, so they can take this pattern and say, I like the zany crooked edges, and they can kind of make it really dense, so it's a lot of zany, or they can kind of stretch it out so it's less dense of quilting, depending on what you want. So that's something to consider as you pick your patterns. Like these paisleys in this quilt, I could have made them bigger, or I could have gone really small. So I tend to be a medium person, kind of both places. So the density of your quilting is something that would be something that you could ask them. So what quilting designs do they have? And then you ask them if they would suggest a thread color. I think on this one it looks like I used a variegated, and she probably suggested that because I probably wouldn't have picked that because I tend to pick gray. so not very exciting. And I think on this quilt my quilter wanted to do it in a color, and I said no, it had to be black thread. So whatever. Stand up for yourself if you're sure you what you want. So what quilting designs do you have? What thread color choices do you have? How much are your services? Generally speaking, a long arm quilter will charge you per square inch. So it can range anywhere from sometimes an inch or a penny per square inch. Common price is like a penny and a half or a penny and 3/4 per square inch. Sometimes two. I think in California it's like 3 to 4 cents per square inch. So it just kind of depends where you're at too. So and custom quilting is often more. So find out, and you can just do your measurements of your quilt and just time your square inches by the price they charge per square inch, and you'll get a rough idea of how much it will cost you. It's always good to know how long they're going to have your quilt. So this particular long arm quilter, she was fabulous, but she had your quilt for 6 months. Another good question is, hey, will you do my binding for me at the end? How much would it cost me? Sometimes they will, sometimes they won't. So that's good to know. Will they square up your quilt? It's good to have your quilt all squared up, and we have tutorials on that on the Pinterest page on how to square up a quilt. That it's kind of a good step to do. Will they do it for you? That's a good thing to ask them, and it'll probably cost you if they do. Happy long arm quilter it makes your life so much easier, especially if you're going to be doing a lot of quilts. But find out what they like, and then soon they learn what you like, and then you kind of have a good working relationship over the years, and that's awesome. Generally speaking, just kind of know what you're getting into and know what it's going to cost you, so you don't have this sticker shock at the end when you write your check. Right? So now that we're kind of to the end, and after you get your quilt back from your quilter, or after you're done quilting it, you need to square up your quilt. If you check our Pinterest handouts, there's one on squaring up your quilt that actually links to a couple of good YouTube tutorials that explain it so much better than I ever could. And I must admit, until like 3 or 4 years ago, I never squared up my quilt. So I thought, oh, I'm close enough. Well, it makes a big difference. So do it. It's a good step, and it gives you nice cleaner edges, a nice cleaner, straighter binding. Because if you haven't squared up your quilt, then your binding kind of waves like this. So it's a good step. And we have a couple of good tutorials on our Pinterest page that you could take a look at. And then once you get it squared up and you add your binding, also there's at least 3 different tutorials to look at on doing a double fold binding. That's kind of snazzy, and it lasts long because it's 2 thicknesses of fabric. It tends to wear better. Back in the old days, even on my childhood quilt that my mother made, she just brought the backing over and just sewed it down, and there's nothing wrong with doing that. But if I had really used that quilt a lot, that would have worn very quickly because it was only 1 layer of fabric. Double fold binding is 2 layers of fabric, so it gives you a little extra thickness. Oh, and I can see that I did not square this quilt up. Take a look at that binding as a bad example. If you notice how it kind of waves up there, do you see it? That's because I didn't square up my quilt before I bound it. There's a bad example right there. Anyway, so do it. It's a good thing to get in the habit of doing. So, okay, so you got your quilt all done, and the last thing you need to do, so people know who you are and what you did, is you need to put a label on it. And the library was gracious enough to marketing design this label for us using kind of the library colors. And we have 2 different labels that you can pick that if you would like a label. The only thing we ask is that you had to have made 1 block, at least 1 block, and you may have a label. In order to get one, you would send an email to Cindy or myself, and our email addresses are on every handout that we gave you all year. So you should be good with that, and they're also listed on the library page where you found all your patterns. At the very bottom, also our email addresses are listed there. Send us an email, tell us who you are. We'd love your email, and your email particularly in case we do another quilting project so we can let you know. But also tell us which color label you would like, the white one or the gray one. And then tell us which branch you want to pick it up at. And then every Friday we send out a new batch to the branches, and we'll let you know. Like if you email me this week, I'll say, oh, you missed Friday, but I'll have it at the branch next Friday. So that's what you need to do. And if you live out of town and can't make it in, send us an email, and I'll give you an address. I think our address is on there, where to send it. Send us an envelope with a stamp on it, we'll mail it to you. Okay? 1 stamp is probably all it will take. We'll mail you your label. We're glad, even if you live out of our county and you participate in our project, we're happy to give you a label if you want one. And there's room for you to put the date and maybe write your name in there. We kind of left a little room so you can put some personal details on there. Thank you for participating, and I'm sure we'll be doing down the road maybe another fun project or 2, but we're looking very forward to seeing all your quilts, pillows, table runners, wall hangings, whatever you have decided to do with your project this year. We would love to see them at our quilt show at the end of June.